Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We've had that before, and so I'm sure many of you have experienced that throughout the past year. So apologize for those, and glad you could join us. Um, I have Lance Harrison. He's legal counsel for the Utah Association of Realtors, and so am I, Craig Wagner. We want to talk a little bit today about new construction. On the hotline, we're noticing some themes throughout our questions and the things that people are asking. And certainly new construction and contracts surrounding new construction are, we've noticed an uptick over the last couple of months. And so we want to highlight some of the questions and some of the thoughts, and feel free to chime in if you do have any sort of comments or questions. While this isn't legal advice, we're certainly providing legal information about some of these topics. Well, so because this is a legal live for realtors, we want to start first with the Code of Ethics. So here we have the Code of Ethics and Article 11. It's an article that Lance knows very well, that he's familiar with. Lance, why do we want to start with Article 11 when we're talking about new construction? Does it mention new construction? Why would we want to address this first?
Yeah, Article 11 is a pretty broad article that goes to the competence of real estate agents, and specifically their competence in certain areas that maybe they don't practice regularly, right? We kind of assume that if you practice something regularly, you're going to be competent in that. But when you go outside of your expertise, that is where you should have some caution, right? You should slow down, and you need to take additional steps to be in conformance with Article 11 so that you keep everyone safe, you and your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Article 11, especially that second paragraph where it talks about how realtors shall not undertake to provide specialized professional services concerning a type of property or service that is outside their field of competence, unless they bring someone else in. So I recognize that the market is there's limited inventory, and many buyers are turning to new construction. What this is saying, and certainly there's going to be licensing implications as well, that realtors understand exactly what they're doing when it comes to new construction. In this case, it is different than traditional residential. Very often it's a different contract, right? I mean, there may be instances where you're using the residential Rep C where the home's nearly completed, but outside of that, it's a different contract. It's either going to be the UAR new construction contract, or it's going to be a builder specific contract. And so certainly there are going to be some challenges associated with that, simply because you may not be familiar with the contractual language. So we definitely wanted to start with that premise that as realtors, just because your buyer wants to go into new construction, you may need to bring someone else that is familiar with the process to help mentor you and to help bring some credibility to the transaction. So just wanted to highlight that, and there could certainly be an ethics complaint if you fail in that regard. Okay, so we want to jump into some new construction questions. And again, we recognize that there are many different contracts out there that builders have engaged attorneys to help draft contractual language. The only contract that we can maybe speak to is the UAR one, but we'll definitely talk in generalities to maybe apply to other types of contracts. So we want to first start with the UAR new construction Rep C, and I'll kind of zoom in a little bit, dealing with section 12. So section 12 is a big section, at least in the UAR new construction contract. And this deals with many of the provisions completing the new construction process. So looking at substantial completion, Lance, under 12.2, what exactly do we mean by substantially complete or substantial completion?
Yeah, so this is kind of a section that if you've never done new construction before, right, the regular residential contract doesn't have something like this. So it's new and it just says, hey, in our contract, this is what substantially complete means, and there's a deadline for this to happen. And it really means when you can occupy the residence under whatever local rules are going on, or you have a certificate of occupancy. That's kind of what that means. And so there can still sometimes be work to do after that, but when the local authority says, hey, this is good, they issue it. That's kind of the substantial completion that we're talking about that's covered under this section. And then there's a corresponding deadline that needs to be in accordance with.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. There's a deadline for the property to be complete or substantially complete, right? And both parties have agreed to that. Now, are there certain things that could cause delays or changes to the substantial completion deadline where maybe the builder needs more time or there's some sort of delay associated with that? Is there anything in the REPC that talks about that?
Yeah, so this kind of hits on a theme in kind of new construction and specifically in our contract, but in most new construction contracts, or just the process is going to be a little more loose, right? With deadlines and different things. They have different provisions in the contract that say usually, hey, we can do more things than what it actually says here. We can extend, we can delay for different reasons. Now, specifically in ours, even in that first section, 12.2, the last part, it says, hey, a change order, first of all, if you make a change in the middle of something, that can delay substantial completion. But then down 13, this might be the big one, section 13, unavoidable delay, right? So if something comes up that you can fit into this section, then there's kind of a free delay here that, hey, we don't have to hit that original deadline. We have other options here to push things. So those are some of the big ones, I think. And I think any construction, this is going to be probably the tightest of any that you see because this is probably the most balanced of any new construction to the buyer and the builder. I think that's how ours is. So if you're using a builder's contract, it's probably going to be even more robust, giving the builder more rights and options to delay and things like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we've had a number of calls on the hotline where the builder does need additional time. And frankly, many of you have experienced these types of delays, whether it's with our contract or with the builder specific contract. And frankly, it's a tough building market right now, simply because of cost of materials, labor, permitting process. All of these things can cause delays to, at least in our case, the substantial completion deadline. So it really is just highlighting those things to your buyer, making sure your buyer is aware that this is a possibility. And in section 13, it's a unilateral right. It does require the builder to give written notice, and we do have a form that allows the builder to give that written notice to notify the buyer of the delay. And this is a key component as a listing agent. You're going to want to know, what are the requirements in order for a builder to avail themselves of something like this, where they need to extend the substantial completion deadline. Just like the residential REPC, our contract has the requirements of what a notice needs to look like. So it needs to be in writing, it needs to be signed, it needs to be received by the other side. So those are going to be things that, as a listing agent, if you're using the UAR new construction REPC, you want to pay close attention to and really be familiar with the components of this contract. So certainly delays are things that we're hearing about.
Yeah, Craig, in section 13 here, it's also interesting to know that we have somewhat similar language in the REPC, the regular REPC. And so you want to distinguish what is the difference here. We have these act of God kind of provisions in our regular REPC, but that a lot of times says, hey, the seller will bear the brunt of this, or that the price of the damage, or they can cancel, right? This is different than that. This is really just, hey, if something crazy happens here, or not so crazy in this paragraph, right? We can delay, but it doesn't actually give a right to cancel in this specific section. And this is a little, it's not as crazy as you would think, right? We kind of think of these sections as really crazy things happening. This is just almost anything the builder can fit into an interruption, materials, things that are actually might be more common than not sometimes, especially right now.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And yeah, you're exactly right. There are things within this new construction REPC that are very similar to the residential REPC. So definitely pay close attention to that. I had a call on the hotline just a couple of days ago asking about access to the property. Can a buyer look at the property or go to maybe inspect the property as it's going through the construction process? You'll notice in 12.3, it does talk about this, that the buyer agrees that during the construction, sellers shall have unrestricted right to access the property. So if the buyer already owns the land, then certainly the seller or the builder would have access to the property. It does reserve a right for the buyer to reasonably inspect the property, but not to interfere with the process, or to delay the work, which, you know, at that point, if the buyer is doing that, then certainly that could fall under a delay, and that could, you know, push back substantial completion. So definitely be aware of that. I have seen other builder contracts that don't necessarily have this spelled out. So you want to be, the language is going to matter, and that's kind of going to be a theme throughout this. Lance, let me ask you something. Let's say I have a dispute with the builder. You know, we have a different interpretation of the same language. The builder maybe thinks that they have broad discretion to do something, and the buyer disagrees with that and doesn't think the language supports that. How have you seen, or at least heard on the hotline, those disputes being resolved, and what are the options for a buyer if they aren't satisfied with maybe what the builder is doing?
Yeah, so there's kind of a broad array of options here and different kind of strategies to go around it. Of course, the first one is just having open communication and discussing kind of these matters, and then kind of choosing how hard you want to push on these different areas. Of course, the market is also going to kind of dictate how these things go sometimes, and they can go better with builders at certain times and they can go worse at sometimes. The market right now is very favorable to builders, right? So a lot of times there's not going to be a lot of changing the contract probably, but it's always worth a shot, right? Just to have open communication. But say you're not even asking to change the contract, you just have a different interpretation. And in that case, you might want to talk to an attorney and decide, how do we push this? Not necessarily litigate, but you can try to communicate and negotiate. You can try to demand letter. You can take little baby steps in different directions to try to push them. But ultimately, it'll be up to you and your client how you want to go about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And though new construction contracts are going to have some sort of dispute resolution clause within them. And that's going to be the starting point, right? So if there's a dispute involving the contractual language, that's going to be the starting point. So it may say you need to first mediate. It may say that you go to binding arbitration, or maybe it allows the two parties to litigate the issue. But that's going to be the starting point. So for example, if your buyer thinks I'm just going to sue the builder, well, they may have to overcome what the contract already says. That says, look, binding arbitration. And so that's going to be pretty difficult for a buyer at that juncture. So really, if that's something that's important to the buyer, you need to have a thorough discussion with them about some of these provisions. And I recognize that it's a tough spot for a buyer to try to negotiate certain terms, especially if it's a builder specific contract that's already drafted by an attorney. They may not be willing to make certain modifications to it. But you can ask. And if your buyer wants to move forward with that builder friendly language or that builder specific language, then at least they know with eyes wide open, you know, whether or not a builder has a right to increase the purchase price due to costs going up, or the labor costs going up, or government regulation, or anything along those lines that certainly we've been hearing about on the hotline.
Yeah, and that's a great reminder. I just wanted to point out section 16 really quick, just because that's our contract, right, is a little more open. You can choose up front, do we want to mediate, do we not, or do we want to keep it open that we can decide later? I don't know if many builders give you that option, but yeah, that's ours.
Yep, absolutely. So that's going to be our dispute resolution clause 16 and 17, which mirror the language in the residential rep C. Now, probably, one of the bigger questions that we're getting is whether or not a builder has a unilateral right to raise the purchase price based on cost of materials going up. I mean, we've seen those memes where someone's carrying some plywood and they're saying, I know what I have, and they're willing to trade for 10,000. We've seen those things of the cost of materials going up, and we know that those translate into new construction also going up. So under the UAR's Rep C, if you look at section 12.5, this is the section that talks about a builder's right to pass on certain costs to the buyer. Certainly a change order could also be in play. That would be another way to pass on costs. But when we're talking about the seller or the builder having a right to adjust the purchase price on their own, because the buyer's already agreed to allow for that upfront, 12.5 is the section that's in our new construction Rep C. And frankly, I would imagine many builders have language that is somewhat different than what our language is. It's probably a little more broad and probably, as Lance has said, a little looser and a little more builder friendly on that front. But if you look at 12.5, it says, if any regulatory requirements for construction of the residence change during the course of construction and result in an increase in the cost of labor and or materials, the seller reserves the right to adjust the purchase price for the property to correspond with such regulatory changes. In such event, the seller shall provide the buyer with a specific description of the regulatory change or changes and an itemization of the costs incurred to comply with the change or changes. This is much more narrow. And frankly, I think it may be tested in the upcoming months as to what constitute a regulatory requirement for construction. Certainly, we know that through this current pandemic and over the last year, there's been there's been government regulations affecting supply chains. And so the question is whether or not that extends to regulatory requirements for construction of the residence have changed over the course of construction. It's frankly, it's one of the only arguments a builder can make at this point if they use the UAR new construction Rep C. Lance, in kind of your calls on the hotline, if a builder does change the price or move it up, is that something that is uncommon in builder contracts, or is it something that realtors should be looking for when advising their clients?
Yeah, I definitely think, especially right now, it's becoming more and more common. And I think realtors have to kind of set the landscape for their clients. And that's not telling them whether or not it's going to happen or what this language means if they fight about it, but it's just preparing them for potential arguments or potential outcomes that maybe the price isn't as set as we originally thought. How much flexibility do we have? How much pushback are we willing to do if something like this happened? And just making sure they understand those risks going forward for sure.
Yeah, and that's going to be your greatest value proposition as a buyer's agent, is understanding the contract and pointing out language that may not be very buyer friendly. Those are going to be things that you would definitely want to have a discussion with your buyer about. One last point that I do want to bring up is the idea of commissions. And we've kind of emphasized this throughout the past couple of years, is when you sign a buyer broker agreement with your buyer, who's responsible for the buyer commission? The buyer, right? I mean, that's what it says. Now, it may be offset by a third party like the seller, or in this case, the builder or the listing brokerage, but ultimately it's a buyer responsibility. If you're helping your buyer purchase a new construction property that's not listed on the MLS, just bear in mind, there is not an offer of compensation from the listing broker or the builder at that point. So you're going to have a dialogue with your buyer of, okay, do we include that in the offer? Do we have something in writing with the builder that's outside of the contract between the buyer's brokerage and the builder, kind of like a for sale by owner commission agreement? Or do we have some sort of agreement between the listing brokerage and the buyer's brokerage? So just bear in mind, I mean, if it's on the MLS, then that's a little cleaner as far as the offer of compensation from a listing broker. But if it's not guaranteed. And ultimately, that's going to be a buyer responsibility, and you have to have that dialogue with your buyer.
Yeah, I would just highlight that, because I would just say, do not assume anything, even if you've heard things about a builder or not. And a lot of builders are really great about paying commissions. Some aren't, and they kind of change depending on the market sometimes even. So just don't assume, be safe, have that conversation with your client up front and decide how to move forward to get you paid, so there's not an argument about it later.
Yeah, exactly. And if the builder has promised to pay you, then get it in writing. Great. And that'll be enforceable, and that'll be something that you can then point to as far as your right to receive compensation. So I know that there's other things that we could certainly talk about when it comes to new construction, but we did want to be not brief, but concise about what we're talking about. Pay close attention to the contractual details. Definitely look at that. Feel free to call the hotline if you have additional questions, talk to your broker. But again, as we started at the very beginning, if you don't feel comfortable representing a buyer in a new construction process, then certainly don't do it just to gain the experience. Engage someone else within your brokers to help you with that. That can maybe guide you through the process, or at least be there for questions and help you with those things. So excellent. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning. Feel free to call the legal hotline. We're open Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8:30 to 4. Happy to answer your questions, and feel free to let us know if there's any topics you'd love for us to cover. Thanks again. Till next time. Bye.